Okay, we're going to start. Hopefully, Congresswoman Dingell will stop by sometime during the course of this presentation. I'm Jim Hecker. I'm counsel and executive director of WIRES. I want to thank Congresswoman Dingell for securing this room for us. When she comes, well, I don't really need to introduce her. She's pretty well known as a third-term congresswoman from the Detroit area, Michigan's 12th district. She's got an impressive resume, including the Board of Governors of Wayne State University and the GM Foundation, and lots of civic activities. She also has the history of being married to the legendary John Dingell from Michigan, from the same district. The late John Dingell, unfortunately, but as a former regulator, I remember him very well for his sending me Dingellgrams with these unanswerable series of questions. Put us all on the spot over at FERC. We have a great panel for you today, and I hope you can stay for the whole thing. I should start off by saying what WIRES is. We're an international nonprofit trade association. We specialize in promoting transmission infrastructure. This is probably the 12th or 13th WIRES University that we've done, and our goal is pretty straightforward. First, we want to give you some unvarnished data and information about how the grid works, about how it's planned, how it's regulated, and then we also want to take a step back and look into the future a bit about what the transmission grid must become as circumstances change, and boy, they are changing pretty rapidly. Distributed resources, clean energy technologies, the advent of competitive power markets, state public policy that is evolving pretty rapidly. So as those things change and evolve, we need an adaptable, robust transmission system. I should say that WIRES is, you can find us at www.wiresgroup.com on the web, and I hope you look at the site. A lot of our previous reports are there, and a lot of information about the grid. So today we are exploring a major change in the energy economy. We know it's coming. We know a lot about what it will look like, what that energy economy will look like, and we know that today's grid will be seriously challenged to meet the needs of the future. Electrification is really a cluster of different changes that add up to a greater penetration of electricity into the energy economies of North America. Yogi Berra used to say that it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, and that's only partly true. I think we've done a pretty good job in the report we're announcing today of looking down the road a quarter century or more to an energy economy that's going to look pretty different, could look very different. In a time of fundamental economic and technological change, it's imperative that we give our best shot to looking into the future, Yogi Berra notwithstanding. The report, which on electrification and its implications for the transmission system, was written by our friends at the Brattle Group, can be understood as really, in my view anyway, two major developments combined: electrification of the transportation sector and also heating technology, and a shift in the generation mix towards location-constrained resources, that is renewables. We want to give you a rounded picture this afternoon of these developments and why investment in high voltage transmission remains a high priority for North American energy economies and policymakers. Well, I'll introduce our panelists, and we will, do we decide what order you wanted to present in? We'll just start with Jürgen and just go down the row. How's that? Okay. Jürgen Weiss is the author of the report that we hope you pick up a copy and read, or you can read it online. It's a real gem, but it's challenging. Jürgen is a principal at the Brattle Group. He spearheads the firm's decarbonization and electrification initiatives. Sounds very, very mysterious, doesn't it?
It is.
Deep decarbonization. Well, he advises utilities, governments, non-governmental organizations, North America, Europe, Asia, Middle East. Whenever I pick up the phone and call him, I never know what language he's going to answer in. But he's a frequent speaker, and the Brattle Group, I'm happy to say, has been a great help to Wires in helping us understand and plan for the electric economy of the future. Genevieve Cullen is with us as president of the Electric Drive Transportation Association. Now, this is really fascinating that we would have a transportation specialist, and the reason is buried in this report of Jürgen's. The advent of electric transportation is going to change the demand for electricity, and we want to know more about how that's going to happen, how soon it's going to happen, what the barriers might be, and so forth. And I think Genevieve is in a perfect position to advise us on that. The EDTA is a trade association, promotes battery, hybrid, plug-in vehicles, fuel cell electric drive technologies, and infrastructure. She was Energy Counsel to U.S. Senator Evan Bayh, and has a long history of federal policy work. And I want to thank her for being here. That's great. Our final presenter is someone who may be a little more focused on the energy industry itself. Betsy Beck is Director of Electricity Markets and Transmission at AWEA, the American Wind Energy Association. Known Betsy for a long time, she's got a great understanding both of renewable energy development and the grid that those developments depend on. She is an advocate for stronger policy to promote expansion and efficient utilization of electric transmission, and has worked with Wires and with other groups interested in the grid for quite a while. I'm glad she's here from chilly Minneapolis. We'll start with you, Jürgen, and I look forward to your remarks.
All right, thank you. And how does this work? All right. Thanks, Jim. Thank you all for coming. So my name is Jürgen Weiss. And I want to say, even though Jim very kindly mentioned me or cited me as the author of the paper, of course I'm not the only author of the paper. There's a group of us who did this. We're mostly economists and do analytical work. Very active in the electricity space for many years, working to design markets, wholesale power markets, in lots and lots of places, and working with all stakeholders on various issues. So I'm going to try to give you a very brief overview of the study we did, which was really, as Jim described, to explore how electrification of the energy industry, energy sector, will ultimately drive and to what extent it will drive the need for a more robust transmission infrastructure. What do we mean by electrification? Just to be completely clear, we mean converting end uses of energy that are fueled by something other than electricity today into using electricity directly instead. So the most obvious examples are transportation, electric cars, but space and water heating are often fueled by natural gas or oil. So one could electrify those. And then there are various industrial processes, many of which are associated with heat production of some kind. In an industrial process that could also be electrified, where the heat could be made with electricity as opposed to with burning a fuel, basically. The basic story is that electrification will create additional demand for electricity, and that in turn means two things. One, something has to make the electricity. That's typically some form of power generation, and that power generation has to be connected to the grid so it can be, transported to where it is used. And then the other major thing that's happening is if you add various end uses of electricity that have a certain time profile to them, if you want, then it may change the overall time profile of electricity use in various places. And we build a transmission system in part to make sure that electricity is provided reliably, 24/7 on a minute-by-minute basis. And so having a different profile of electricity use could also imply changes, investments you have to make in transmission to allow continued reliable operation of the grid. So that's the basic story. Electrification overall is driven by a number of factors. This here just gives you, by the way, this presentation is outside. I'm sure it's going to be available on some web format. And so one important driver of electrification is greenhouse gas emissions, climate change in some ways. So here you just have two tables that show by broad region in the US the number of states that have some kind of greenhouse gas emission reduction goal or law, and what percentage of the population that represents. So close to 60% of the US population at this point live in a state that has some kind of greenhouse gas emissions reduction mandate. And then so that's a relevant driver. Very, very simple. Burning fossil fuels in transportation results in greenhouse gas emissions. Gasoline. Using electricity may or may not result in greenhouse gas emissions depending on the energy mix, but electric cars are much more efficient in converting energy into miles driven. And so even if you have a not perfectly clean electricity system, you may still get greenhouse gas emissions savings by switching from a gasoline car to an electric car. And then underneath, you just you see the number of regions that we looked at and how they differ in their profiles, and a number of important factors for electrification. How expensive is gas? So when we look at whether or not you would replace your gas-fired furnace with, say, a heat pump, which is an electric heating system, then obviously the price of gas relative to the price of electricity matters. So there's a fair amount of variation in the United States across regions in the price of gas, the price of electricity, how cold it gets in the winter, and therefore how much heating you need. And again, whether you have strong greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. If there are, a lot of states now have 80% economy-wide decarbonization. So that's deep decarbonization targets by 2050. So if you have a fair amount of heating need in your state, at some point you have to tackle the greenhouse gas emissions associated with heating. So, but that's only one factor. There are other factors potentially driving electrification. I'm going to focus on the transportation sector because that is the most obvious place where electrification is likely going to take place, whether or not their greenhouse gas emissions reductions are a significant driver. You can see here, like the third from the right item is climate change, but there are a number of other things that are going on that are sort of pushing transport into a new paradigm. And we might hear, Genevieve might talk a little bit more about that. So we have the sharing economy, right? So this time I didn't, Jim, but normally when I'm in DC and I hop on one of these electric scooters for a mile or two, so there are new modes of transportation that are electric that are emerging. There are then new business models, the Lyft and Uber, There are advances in EV technology that suggest that for equal performance in the not very distant future at all, an electric vehicle, an electric light-duty vehicle may be cheaper to buy for equal performance. So then people will start buying these things because they're more economical. Urbanization, people just move into the cities. In cities, you don't need to drive very long distances, and therefore you may be okay with a lower range. And then I think there are two factors that are also relevant in the transportation sector. There are government policies. I suspect many of you will sort of understand what country is mentioned here by image. China doesn't have an incumbent internal combustion engine industry, car industry. I was born in Stuttgart. There's a lot of car industry there. So for them, pushing for electric transport is really an economic development strategy, right? They can displace other people's car sales as opposed to displacing their own car sales, which is the problem in the sort of established car countries like the US and Germany and Japan. And then sort of somewhat related to that, there are new entrants, just disruptors. Companies that are innovating, that see an opportunity to disrupt the market. And so Tesla is the prime example of that. Making an electric car, in some sense, is much less complex than making an internal combustion engine car, and therefore the barrier to entry for new players have just declined. And so you can see, companies like Tesla, but there are lots of companies in China that are sort of on the path to introducing electrically driven vehicles, light-duty vehicles, buses, and so on and so forth. And then underneath you just see all the movement in the space in pictures. I mean, the thing that strikes me, for example, is at this point, China adds a number of electric buses to its fleet per week that exceeds the entire London bus fleet. So just give you a sense of how quickly things are going. So in the bottom, so that it's hard to see. So the German Postal Service at some point just bought a startup and is now making its own fully electric postal delivery trucks. Dyson, the guy who makes the vacuum cleaner, is going to introduce an electric car in the next few years. So those are called indicators that stuff is happening relatively quickly, which in some sense is an indicator that the transportation sector may actually flip relatively quickly, because there are all these factors that I just described coming together to create an environment where increasingly sort of the various factors align to make electrified transport very attractive relative to conventional transport. And so to go back to Yogi Berra, I suppose, so that means that you can, maybe you can forecast a relatively rapid adoption of electric transport. Here's a whole range of transports that vary tremendously between those that, the EIA traditionally gets us to maybe 10% share of EVs being sold in 2050, to much more aggressive assumptions that really see this hockey stick that is an adoption of electric transport that is much more similar to how cell phones were adopted or how social media were adopted. And so before I move to transmission, so the interesting thing for a system that requires long investments in long-lived assets, right? So the entire electricity system lasts for a long time. The wires, the transmission wires, they last half a century or more. Right? The distribution wires last a century. When the gas system blew up in South San Francisco a few years ago, those gas pipelines were out of wood. They were built in the 19th century. So the infrastructure is expensive, and then it stays in the ground for a long time. So uncertainty about how quickly electrification occurs probably creates a need to invest, assuming that it'll happen faster, because it just takes a long time to plan these investments, and then once you made them, you've made them, right? They're sunk for a long time. All right, so this is background in electrification. So we used sort of these kinds of projected adoption rates for, this was transportation. We developed similar ones for heating and industrial processes to develop basically 2030 and 2050 scenarios, a base case and a high electrification case. And on the left side, you see basically assumed penetration rates of electrified uses in these sectors. And you see that in our base case, you get maybe 10% roughly electrification by 2030, but then 30 to 40% electrification by 2050. We wanted to include a high electrification case because basically you need something like 100% electrification of transportation and buildings, space and water heating if you want to meet 80 by 50, so 80% greenhouse gas reductions economy-wide by 2050. There are just a certain number of economic activities that are going to be really hard to decarbonize. So call those 20%, which means the other 80% need to be fully decarbonized. Electrification is a pathway of accomplishing that. There are other pathways. I don't have time to go into those. Many of those actually also involve electrification, just indirectly. So one example, the auto industry will tell you that we should keep the, some members of the auto industry will tell you that, well, we should look at what's called e-fuels, which are liquid fuels that are drop-in fuels, so they replace the gasoline, and we make the liquid fuel from electricity by splitting basically water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then we're going to steer in some other molecules, carbon mostly molecules, to make something that looks like gasoline, except it's potentially made 100% renewable. Turns out if that's the pathway, you need a lot more electricity than our estimates, because the efficiency of making these fuels compared to battery electric vehicles is very, very low. So anyway, we end up with a sort of, in our modeling, we end up with these scenarios that have sort of a moderate amount of electrification in the base case, 30 to 40% by 2050, but much less by 2030. But then we wanted to contrast that with some more aggressive case that would meet basically decarbonization goals by mid-century. What happens if you do that? You can see that on the right. In the extreme case, we might double our electricity consumption relative to today by 2050. So we have our generation capacity is roughly the equivalent of 1,000 nuclear plants in the United States. So you'd have to build an extra 1,000 nuclear plants. It takes us about, how many years, Jim, you think? 30 years or so to build one? So give you a sense, this is the next quarter century we're talking about, right? It's not the extreme, so a not unrealistic sort of outcome is that we'll double our electricity consumption, and that's a pretty significant lift. Even half that would be, even building the equivalent of 500 nuclear plants would be a pretty significant lift over the next 25 years. All right, I already mentioned this, so increasing electricity demand, right, that was the previous slide. So here, the stuff here on the right, so this additional megawatt hours that would be consumed, they translate into a potential additional need for transmission in two ways. One, this is the electricity supply. Something has to supply the electricity, and wherever that electricity is generated has to be transported to load. The other way is when people charge their cars and when they heat their homes with electricity, that will change the profile of electricity demand overall. And we want to make sure we have enough transmission that that power is available when people plug in their cars to charge. I think we'll hear a little bit more about this later. I mean, so on the generation side, the U.S. has fantastic renewable resources. That's increasingly evident in the kinds of power that both utilities buy and that corporations are buying. The map on the right gives you kind of a very high level. In the center of the country, the wind resource, the land-based wind resource is really tremendous. On the East Coast, the offshore wind resource is fantastic. And then in the south and southwest, the solar resources are fantastic. Really fantastic in a sense of world-class. So in the Midwest, you can now buy wind for roughly 2 cents a kilowatt hour. That same wind resource, same technology in Germany would cost you 6 or 7 cents. Right? So it's that much better in terms, the wind just blows really hard, basically, right? And there's a lot of open land, so it's pretty cheap to do these things in the US. However, so as Jim pointed out, these are kind of location-constrained resources. If you want to build the wind really where the wind blows hardest, then that's not necessarily where the electric demand will be, because that is going to be distributed on the coasts and in big cities a lot more than it is in sort of rural Arkansas or rural Kansas or Iowa. And so you need to sort of connect those resources to the rest of the system so they can be transported to the demand centers. Here on the left, we just summarize the resource mix that would result by region. Again, we assumed, but that's a pretty realistic assumption given what's currently happening, that roughly you can think it's roughly split equally between solar and on and offshore wind. Depending on where you are, on the East Coast, it's going to be a lot of offshore wind. If you're going to be in the middle of the country, it's going to be a lot of wind. The further south you go, it's going to be wind and solar. And in the West, it's going to be a whole bunch of stuff because they have pretty good onshore wind resources and solar resources. One important point, because you'll find that discussed a lot, how about distributed resources? How about rooftop solar and all of these things, right? Do we really need to string along all these sort of power lines when we can just stick solar panels on the roofs? That is a really complicated topic, but it is quite likely that even though we will see a lot more distributed resources, distributed resources tend to be smaller, right? Because roofs are much smaller than a big field in the Arizona desert. The smaller the system, the more expensive it is. Also, just the potential, the roof space, the space near the load centers on which you could stick, say, solar panels or wind turbines is rather limited relative to the demand in those places. So we assumed that a fair amount of distributed generation would take place, but to meet all this additional demand, we'll almost certainly need to, build a lot more resources that aren't distributed. All right, I'm getting there. And what does that mean then? So, meeting this additional demand, we estimated, then translates into transmission investments. And here you see on the very left, you see the 10-year average investment in the transmission system, which has been roughly $15 billion a year. We would add to that incrementally between 3 and 7 billion in the near term. So 7 would be roughly increasing it by 50%, 3 more by like 20% or so. And then through 2050, after 2030, you'd have to add between 7 and 25 billion a year. So the very tiny graph on the left gives you kind of the really year by year the history. It turns out that a couple of years in recent history we spend as much as 20 billion. So think about essentially also doubling the transmission investment relative to the recent past. So that adds up. 20 billion times 20 years is $400 billion. So that's real money, obviously. But more importantly, also just it's a lot of investment, and given the lead times for siting, permitting, financing, figuring out who pays for transmission, that amount of transmission requires a lot of thinking now, because otherwise will be very hard to get this accomplished. And I'm going to make one final point. So 25 billion a year, let's just say 400 or 500 billion over 20 years. That's a really, really big number. It's important to take away that that's not the same as saying, oh, this is going to cost consumers a lot. It's important to keep in mind that of a typical electricity bill, just a little bit more than 10% is the cost of transmission. So that's one. The largest piece, as you can see, is the cost of generation, the power plants themselves. As I had pointed out, one of the important points of transmission in our report and more generally is to access cheap generation. So, if I have to spend money to get to a place where the wind blows really, really hard, it may increase my transmission investment and therefore the cost of transmission in the bill, but it would reduce the cost of generation in the bill. And then since generation is 60% and transmission is 13%, that alone would actually sort of mitigate, if you want, the pure cost impact of the transmission investment. And then the second and really important point is electrification increases overall demand. A big chunk of the electric system is fixed infrastructure, okay? So fixed infrastructure is best if you use it a lot. So to the extent we increase demand and we use the existing system as well as the new system to meet this demand, we're increasing the denominator, right? We're dividing by more units, which means the average per kilowatt of consumption or per kilowatt hour of consumption cost actually decreases. So to the extent that transmission facilitates and enables electrification of the system, it's entirely possible, if not likely, that average electric rates might decline. And this is my crossover to Genevieve in some sense. That's not even the right comparison, right? Because what people do, they currently drive their cars with gasoline, and in the future they're driving their cars with electricity. So what you really wonder about is does the cost of transportation, for example, increase or decrease as people move from having regular cars to electric cars? And there the answer is almost certainly that the cost of driving will be much lower. So the benefits to consumers, even if electric rates went up a little, are likely still substantial. And that's my summary. We'll sort of get into a discussion, I think, and questions also when we're all done, right? Okay, thank you. Oh, this is a lot, okay. I'm going to go through this because they're all here, and okay, it's me. And there you go.
You keep me up. Well done. Thank you. Is it this one?
There, yeah. Oops.
No, not that one.
There we go.
Oh, awesome. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me, Jim. I appreciate the chance to talk about this. As Jim said, I'm Genevieve Cullen. I'm with the Electric Drive Transportation Association. My members are automakers, electric utilities, folks in the component and associated supply chains, as well as the people in the charging infrastructure side of electric transportation. We are a very diverse group of folks, and what we have all in common is the vision that where transportation is headed is electrification. And what Jürgen has looked at and what we're talking about is what does that mean for transmission and for energy consumption in a macro sense. But I'm going to give you just want to give you a snapshot of what does the market look like for electric transportation, where do we see it going, and then we can dig into the transmission details. But just to begin, the plug-in electric drive vehicles, that's battery electrics and plug-in hybrids, first came to the market, if we leave behind California in the 90s, first came to the market in a commercial scale in 2010. That was the Leaf and the Volt. They were just sold in a couple of markets. By the end of 2018, over 1 million plug-in vehicles have been sold, and those two models have grown to be close to 4 dozen models of cars across price points and duty cycles. That number is going to increase exponentially in the next 10 years. At the same, I think an instructive piece of, we talk about inflection points. Where's this, how is this market growing? If you look, the difference between 2017 and 2018 sales of plug-in vehicles, it's an 86% year-over-year increase. That's a pretty meaningful change. At the same time, we are looking at the growth of infrastructure to serve that. This is, we're seeing somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 public charging facilities. Obviously that doesn't include homes, it doesn't include workplaces. Those are just strictly public facilities. To give you a sense of where the market's going, I just have this slide. Don't try and read it. It's hard to parse it. But what it's meant to just show you is that every major automaker has announced plans, not just to Congress, not just to me, but to Wall Street, that this is where their business case is going, that they are going to be electrifying their fleets. What that leads to, so the folks, smarter folks than I, who are projecting sales outwards, and Jürgen had that great slide that showed a variety of projections. I'm just going to pick one. I like this one. This is Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and it shows that the sales of electric vehicles will surpass internal combustion engine sales before 2040. That's pretty fast uptake, and although our timelines are not the speed as slow as transmission, but the fact is, if you look, there are 250 million light-duty vehicles in the car park today. I think last year there were in the United States 17 million cars, light-duty cars were sold. So and we are in the hundreds of thousands, but so we were at maybe 2% of that market. But so in 20 years to surpass that, that's pretty fast uptake. I think it's also important to note here, because we spend a lot of time talking about passenger cars, it's what people understand and see. But electrification in the medium and heavy duty segment in commercial fleets is really going to drive markets, and it's certainly going to change demand profiles, because a bigger vehicle with a different duty cycle, say if you're talking about a bus that's moving around all day, or a long haul truck, their use profile for electricity will be different. And by different, I mean bigger. They need different infrastructure options. Obviously, they're fleets, so there'll be centralized charging facilities, but they're also, if you're talking about buses or if you're talking about delivery trucks, they're going to need fast charge options out there in the world. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, when I say medium and heavy duty, if you're looking at all of these sizes of vehicles, and this is analysis of when the break-even is in favor of electric transportation, and those are all in the pretty near term. The other market and technology trend that changes the uptake of electric transportation, and consequently the electricity demand profile, are the new mobility models. Everyone says this over and over again. Nobody really knows what they mean by it, but the fact is what's changing transportation is increasing automation, increasing connectivity, and ride-sharing models. How we consume transportation is changing, and that will change demand profiles too. If there is a massive shift to ride sharing, how those vehicles are used is different than your personal vehicle. Is that vehicle on the road 24 hours a day to maximize its value? I think that's what a lot of folks are imagining in that space. That has implications for energy demand and demand profiles. So the bottom line is, and I think I'm going to disappoint you and not disagree with Jürgen, because that would be more interesting if I did. But the fact is, yes, thank you. The future of transportation is electric. And whether we do that in 10 years or 15, the time for planning is now, because the timelines for production, for infrastructure, and for the grid are fairly long. And we can look at differences in the scale and timing of grid impacts, and they are very much dependent on what, if the uptake happens in medium and heavy duty, if it happens faster in the passenger side, if there's a growth in storage, if there are, if we turn to different options for securing electricity. And on the vehicle side, we are looking at pushing forward on technology innovation. People want longer range. They want it cheaper. They want to make sure that the battery will last as long as they want to have their car. The market conditions have to change. There's a lot of education. People have to understand what their options are. And I think people that market uptake between 2017 and 2018 is actually showing you that the consumer education piece of this is actually trending in the right direction. And finally, there are still policy imperatives and impediments that will in fact color how the speed of uptake on the vehicle side and how fast we need to make changes in our electricity and transmission grids, right? And obviously, we want to see more consumer investment. We want to see more manufacturer investment. We want to be able to accommodate the diverse players that are going to come into this field, as in electricity demand and software and data ownership. All of those things will have to come into play. And we think there are positive trends in all of those directions. And finally, as Jürgen said, all of these have beneficial impacts. Not every increase in electricity demand results in a need for new generation, because managed demand is the more beneficial use of existing assets. As far as getting consumer value, investor value, and even emissions impacts. If you're using existing capabilities of the grid and just using them better with managed demand, then you get all of those cost and environmental benefits associated with electric transportation. We can get super technical or keep it light, but we'll wait to the end for questions. Thank you.
And last, but hopefully not least, I'm Betsy Beck with the American Wind Energy Association. Thank you, Jim, for having me here today. I love to talk about transmission. That's what I do every day, so I'm really happy to be here and really excited to be here in the context of talking about electrification. I was just sharing before the panel that I didn't think I could come talk about electrification until I owned an electric car. So I went and bought an electric car on Monday, and now I can be a member of the club, and now I can speak more authoritatively on electrification issues. So if you want to talk to me more, a lot of what these folks are talking about really rang true. The car I ended up buying I didn't know existed like 2 months ago, and I saw it at the auto show and said, this is amazing. So I'm excited to be a new consumer in this space. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about wind and renewables broadly and how it fits into this electrification future. For those of you who don't know, we as the National Trade Association for the Wind Industry, we represent the entire supply chain for the industry, manufacturers, all the way to our customers, including companies like Google and Walmart and other companies that are starting to invest in renewables. And also this space, for those of you who don't know, have a lot of acronyms. So if I say an acronym that you don't know, just wave at me and I'll make sure to correct myself. So let's see, let me pull my slides up. Okay, great. And a couple of other things I wanted to mention before I get started. AWEA did just put out an electrification report, I believe last month, and I left some copies of our executive summary on the table out there, so please grab one on your way out, and please head over to our website to read our paper a little bit more in depth. We did focus in that paper on state policies that can be enacted to pair electrification strategies with renewable procurement. I will be corrected if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that most consumers who are looking to buy electric vehicles are doing so because they would like to have a cleaner impact. And so it's important, I think, that we think about pairing electrification with renewables, because most drivers, I think, would like to be charging their electric vehicle with wind or solar or other carbon-free resources, not dirty fossil fuels. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a background on kind of the state of play of the renewable industry and then talk a little bit about how it's intersecting with electrification trends. So for those of you who don't know, we are nearing the 100 gigawatt or 100,000 megawatt mark of installed wind in the US. I think we ended 2018 with around 96 gigawatts. I haven't seen the latest numbers for Q1 yet, but this is a really big milestone that we're getting close to reaching. And since we're on the Hill, I can't not briefly mention the PTC, which of course you know is being phased out, but the PTC phase out has maintained a really steady stream of development over the past 4 years. We've seen over 7 gigawatts of wind additions over the past 4 years. The next couple years are going to be just as strong, if not stronger. So we're at a point where we're kind of out of that boom-bust cycle, and we're seeing sustained development year in, year out. And so, you know, wind is here today. It's here now. We're no longer an emerging new technology. We're very mainstream. And it's the cheapest form of new energy in many parts of the country. And Jürgen mentioned it earlier, but offshore wind is a new trend that we're seeing in the industry. I think it's something that folks who maybe aren't focused on the parts of the country that are really engaging in offshore right now may be surprised when they learn a little bit more about what's going in the offshore industry right now. A lot of states on the eastern seaboard are setting targets and investing heavily in offshore wind. And so we expect to see around 2 gigawatts of offshore wind installed and operational in about 5 years from now. And that is going to be a huge shift when we've got only 30 megawatts of offshore wind operational today off the coast of Rhode Island. So that industry is really going to be taking off on the East Coast in the very near term. We've got about 25 gigawatts of development capacity being developed right now. So that's sort of, it's really not a question of if, but a question of when and how quickly. And we are just about to put out, this is a teaser and why I didn't include some of our great charts, we're about to put out our annual report next week, and so I was not allowed to steal the thunder of my research team with some of our latest data. So make a note to yourself, next Tuesday we'll be putting out our 2018 annual report with our latest numbers on the state of the industry. But Texas, Iowa, and Oklahoma do continue to be the top 3 wind states. And I think, Jürgen talked a little bit about this, but this isn't a major disagreement, but a minor disagreement in that it will take electrification to drive, demand for our renewables. What we're really seeing already today is that customer preference and cost are the 2 primary drivers for wind and renewable deployment right now. 2018 was, I think, these are not full 2018 numbers, but close. But 2018, of the 4 or 5 gigawatts of wind that were contracted for, nearly 50% of that wind was being bought by corporate and industrial consumers. So as I noted here, and then 45% of that, about 50% that were corporate industrial buyers, 45% of those folks were new buyers, so new entrants to the market of signing PPAs to invest in wind. So it's no longer, as you can see from this chart, it's no longer just the tech companies, it's no longer just Google, Microsoft, and Facebook, although they continue to be very big players. But we're seeing companies like AT&T, Nike, Kohler, Cargill, Vail Resorts, companies that are not necessarily known for being early movers and shakers, moving into this space, both because it makes sense on a cost basis, but also because consumer preference and consumer demand is moving in this direction. And investors are looking for companies to become more sustainable as well. So it's important, I think, to note that we've already made a lot of progress in terms of integrating a lot of renewables. We have a lot more work to do as we see higher penetrations, but we're learning a lot of really valuable lessons in the parts of the country that have a lot of renewables already. So in 2018, I think it's really notable that wind provided 6.5% of all the electricity consumed in the United States last year. And even more notably, I think, in the region of the country that is actually not this map, but the region, that's MISO, which I'll get to in a minute. But SPP, which is the region basically just west of the area highlighted on this map, saw 24% of all of their electricity consumed in 2018 come from wind. I mean, that's a quarter of every time you turn on the light switch that power came from wind in that part of the country. And again, they're doing that all reliably. Costs are extremely low in that part of the country. And they also saw an instantaneous wind penetration of 64%. And so what they're learning there is that you can reliably integrate large amounts of wind. They go from times of day where wind is low, or times of the year when wind is traditionally not generating at a high output, to very high outputs, and they can do that all today with their existing transmission system and wonderful grid operators. Similarly, ERCOT, which is most of Texas, but not all of Texas, received almost 20% of all their electricity from wind and saw 54% wind penetration. And obviously we're here to talk about transmission, and a key reason that those regions of the country have been able to integrate that much wind, the Midwest, MISO, SPP, and ERCOT, is because they proactively invested in transmission over the past decade or so, and that has enabled them to lower costs for consumers and integrate all these renewables, and again, doing so reliably. And they've seen 2 to 3 or more dollars of benefit for every dollar in transmission that they invested. So I know Jürgen was hedging a little on, is transmission going to deliver that benefit? But the fact of the matter is the planning processes that the grid operators go through, they only build transmission that they know can confidently say is going to, they build economic transmission that's going to deliver benefits to consumers. And looking back on these investments, it has certainly done so. But that's not to say we're done building transmission. We invested a lot over the past decade. It enabled a lot of wind, but we're hitting a point where we're seeing a lot of congestion and curtailment of renewables in these regions because there's not enough capacity to keep moving the wind out of the windy regions and to the load centers, which there are not a ton of in this part of the country. So transmission is really continuing to create some challenges. And again, interregional transmission is something that is really important to, again, moving that power back to Jürgen's map of where all those where the renewables are being produced to where they need to be consumed. We need more interregional transmission to move that power even further than we are able to move it today. And lastly, I included this map to highlight, this is actually the current map of new energy projects, although they're mostly wind and solar, but there's a few gas projects in there as well, where they're located in the MISO region that are trying to get on the grid. So we're seeing, not only is there not enough transmission to move the energy that's already being produced to where it's needed, which manifests in congestion, but there's a lot of more transmission that's needed to enable this new renewables that are already there, already being developed, already trying to meet customer demand to get onto the grid. And I wanted to, or Jürgen mentioned it, but dovetail a little bit on one of his final points about why do we need transmission if maybe we're going to put solar on everybody's roof and a Tesla Powerwall in everyone's garage. But the fact of the matter is that a large and strongly networked transmission system delivers more benefits even with those other resources on the grid. And fundamentally, utility scale renewables have higher capacity factors than distributed resources. You gain huge economies of scale like anything else by big projects versus building smaller projects. And transmission, by having a transmission system that connects more of the country, you get a lot of diversity benefits. So one of the cool things about wind and solar is wind generally tends to blow stronger at night, and solar obviously is a daytime peaking resource. And when you have transmission that can connect those resources, you can start to see a much firmer product from pairing of different renewable resources. So that transmission system enables you to not need so-called backup power as much because you can always rely on generation in different areas. The wind's always blowing somewhere. The sun is not always shining in the US, but you're able to balance those things out if you've got a robust transmission network. And lastly, I get asked about storage a lot, and storage I think is always, definitely going to be a key piece of the energy future going forward, but fundamentally, storage moves power through time, and transmission moves power through space. So storage is never going to be able to replace transmission in a lot of instances. It can certainly help. It can help increase utilization. It can help make sure that we're getting the most out of our transmission system and can help economically meet needs in certain instances. But fundamentally, the two are not interchangeable, and we're going to need that backbone transmission system to integrate renewables. And so I think just a couple of last comments on electrification. Jürgen's slide, actually, I didn't end up putting my slide in because it kind of captured it similarly, but we really see it as a three-pronged approach. We've got the need for EV infrastructure on the EV side. We need to enable that. But again, like I said, customers want those EVs powered by clean energy. And so we need to think about pairing those two together. And that's what our electrification report talks about. And it is a great thing for wind because I think most EV customers plan to charge their vehicles at night. And that's when wind is blowing the strongest and providing the best resource. So they're really a great pairing together. And so that we hope that policymakers are thinking about that when it comes to EV policies as well. And of course, this all converges on transmission policy. We need that infrastructure in the middle to enable all of these things to come together and work together. So with that, I'll let Jim grill us.
Well, actually, you can grill them, but let me just start off with a couple of questions. Since this is being recorded, I'll step up here. Okay, good. Okay, let's talk a little bit about fast charging. Drivers are, if they're contemplating buying an electric car, probably have some degree of distance anxiety. They're driving out to Charlottesville, and they may not get further than Marshall or something. Your report talks about fast charging, and I know that's something that Genevieve is interested in as well. What are the prospects for developing that and on a large scale, and what does that mean for transmission?
Is this on by default? Yeah. Okay. Great. I'm going to try. I tried the transmission part. So our report does have a nice section that I didn't go into. That has some nice maps. So one of the things that's clear is that if electric transport takes off, then these vehicles have to be charged. And I think more than that, there's some evidence that people have to be very confident that there is enough charging infrastructure out there before they buy a car. So in some sense, there's probably a need for more charging infrastructure than you need physically to meet the charging demand. So people need to be just comfortable. They need to know, oh, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one. So then the question is, how much of that do you need? A lot of it people think is going to take place at home. If everybody charges at home, that has a very different implication for on the grid. Right? Most people's homes sit on the distribution network. Almost all homes, I think. So there are some interesting questions that emerge when there is this Palo Alto neighborhood where everybody has a Tesla and everybody plugs in with a high-speed, relatively fast charger. That may create issues in the distribution system. We didn't talk so much about this today, but we talked a little bit about fleets and mobility services. That paradigm may change in ways where there will be more fleet operators that charge. The Ubers and the Lyfts, we think of them as apps, but also they now lease a lot of cars to their drivers. It's clear they'll own the cars, and once they become autonomous, they might service those cars in various charging hubs. So it's a very different charging infrastructure for those fleets. And then I think there is a lot of travel. That it is long distance, right? Less so by light-duty vehicles, a lot by heavy-duty vehicles. And so our report looked in particular at the charging needs that might emerge for the corridor trips, for the long trips. A truck, sort of a really heavy-duty truck, might have an instantaneous charge rate of 1 megawatt. So the typical, you would plug in your car in your garage, that's like a couple of kilowatts. So the rate at which these trucks may charge, individual trucks, right, might be 500 times that speed. So that's like the equivalent of charging 500 trucks. And then think about your highway truck stop, where you have how many? You might have 20 or 30 or plugs that these truckers or the trucks stop and recharge. So you might have a 30 megawatt load at one of these truck stops. 30 megawatt, I mean, order of magnitude, sort of like Empire State Buildings, sort of think about that, right? So you might sort of have every 30 miles or 50 miles or 100 miles, you had to sort of stick an Empire State Building in terms of the electric load on the grid. And so that could represent a very significant challenge for distribution systems. There are distribution systems that can handle Empire State Buildings. the Empire State Building in New York would be one example, that grid. But so we looked at, well, could you leverage the transmission system for these kinds of things? Because the transmission system is used to sort of having much higher power flows on it. And so we had nice little maps where we overlaid the transmission system, the existing transmission system with highways, and here's an exit, there's an exit. And it turns out there's a fair amount of overlap, which suggests that it's entirely possible that we can leverage the existing transmission infrastructure to quickly ramp up fast charging infrastructure that, even if it's not used by regular drivers very much, it may be needed for them to feel comfortable enough to buy an EV. And it will be needed for if we want to electrify longer distance and heavier duty travel. I'll stop there.
That was a good overview of that. And I'm gonna take a second and step back for those of you who don't just live and breathe all the glorious details of this. But just to clarify, fast charge, right? So the outlets in this room are essentially level 1 charging. It's 120. That's, you can, if you're charging at night, overnight, that actually can work fine for most folks. You have 10 hours to essentially trickle charge your car, depending on how big the battery is. It's all a passenger car might need. Most folks have sort of like a little bit speedier charge, so they go level 2. That's 240. That's what your dryer or your refrigerator draws, right? And that decreases the charging time by about half. And you'll find that's in most of the commercial places where you would go. If you go to a shopping mall, or if you, commercial parking facilities, that most of them have level 2. The next level, 480, which is, you can get 80% of a full charge in, say, 10, 15 minutes, again, depending on the level of depletion, the size of your battery. That obviously is faster, but it's more expensive, and it has more of a draw, so it needs more demand. That's not something you're going to have in your garage. That's not, like, people don't do that at their house. Maybe a couple people do that at their house. But for the vast majority of people, that's a commercial, and it's for commercial facilities. It's for corridors, and for folks who are going to be traveling long distances in a pure battery electric vehicle. For instance, my vehicle is a plug-in hybrid, so when I deplete the charge, it runs on a hybrid gasoline engine, so I don't need fast charge when I travel long distance. But folks who have pure battery electric vehicles will want that option, and sometimes that, as Jürgen pointed out, the psychological need to see it exceeds the actual need to use it. People will just need to know that it's an option for them, so that as a non-economist, the metaphor I use is this market is a slinky dog, right? And the nose is all of this charging infrastructure, and the bunker is the vehicles, and we want to make sure there's not too much space between so that it doesn't collapse in the middle.
I like it.
Thank you. You can use that in the future.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so this is for Genevieve. How are auto companies kind of bridging the gap between, because electric cars are only going to get better sensors, better technology, but how are they working with cities, or because a lot of people live in cities, I think half the population does now. How are they working with cities to increase cities' infrastructure towards a more electric future?
I'm sorry, I meant to repeat the question. I'm sorry, I forgot my instructions. Thank you. The question is, how are automakers working with cities to make sure that the infrastructure profile in cities reflects the need for passenger vehicle recharging? Is that a fair restatement?
Yes.
Well, because drive cycles, that's just how people use their cars, essentially, drive cycle, are so variable. There's a lot of approaches. And whether you're serving the commuters, whether you're serving your transit folks, your commercial vehicles, there are all different options. And utilities and municipal governments and car companies are all working together because it serves all of their benefits to maximize how beneficially electricity is used in their fleets and in their towns. So that you're looking at, like, for instance, the city of New York has, made a commitment to make all of its fleet vehicles electric over the next, it was shorter than 10 years. It's a really short timeline. But so they are looking at installing in the most dense city you can imagine, with the most bureaucratic overlay of jurisdictions, charging in light posts, things that already essentially have a fair amount of electricity streaming through them, how to utilize that, how to incentivize commercial parking facilities to add charging infrastructure, or even in new construction to make sure that there is make ready, essentially, that all new construction is facilitated so that you can just snap on charging to it and you don't have to have the expense of retrofitting. So they're looking at lots of options that are beyond a gas station model. So that goes to, like, so then you incentivize the folks in condos, in commercial parking, in government facilities to sort of move the market together.
Other questions? Yes?
Jürgen, when you're modeling increased demand because of electrification, how does energy efficiency fit into that? Is there a point where energy efficiency is no longer the lowest hanging fruit to reduce demand?
So yeah, the question was how, when we model out sort of this impact of electrification, what the role that energy efficiency plays. So all the model that we use assumes sort of progress on energy efficiency in the traditional system. So along the lines of what we have observed and what maybe EIA or others sort of project in the future. So that's one level of energy efficiency. The amount of potential load that comes from electrification is just so large that unless you remove the entire existing loads for energy efficiency, you're going to have an increase, a pretty substantial, right? As a matter of fact, this doubling does include in the baseline continued progress on energy efficiency. So I think it's embedded for the traditional, and then we do assume, for example, on the vehicle side, that so now on the electrification load itself, we also assume that there will be progress on efficiency there. So heat pumps, if you electrify heating, then there will be progress in heat pump technology that improves the efficiency of heat pumps. We assume a small increase in the efficiency of electric vehicles over time. So currently you get maybe like 3 miles per kilowatt hours, and maybe in the future you get 4 miles per kilowatt hours. I should note, however, that so I work a fair amount on energy efficiency stuff, and economists always sort of have this rebound. It's called rebound. There's this issue where when stuff gets cheaper, whether people actually consume more. And if you, for example, on the electricity, right, if you install light bulbs that only consume 10% of the electricity that the old light bulbs consume, will you be compelled to leave the lights on longer, kind of thing, right? So we don't want to get into that discussion, but on the transportation side, one thing that's fascinating is to try to project how the demand for transportation changes over time, with or without electrification. And I think there are certainly good reasons to believe that we are vastly undersupplied with transportation relative to the amount of transportation we might ask for. There was a fun, I love it so much, so there was a recent a natural experiment that a professor at Berkeley, Max Aufhammer, reported on, where 100 families were given a chauffeur for 60 hours for 1 week. They had their own car, they had to pay for their car, they had to pay for the gas, but they had a chauffeur. And they could just send the car off. And in that week, those cars traveled roughly twice the miles that they normally travel. So just having the this is an experiment that simulates an autonomous vehicle, right? That you can just send off to drop the kids off somewhere and then pick up some ice cream someplace else. And so our forecast for electricity demand through electrification assumes essentially that the vehicle miles traveled increase only a little bit. over the next 20 or 30 years, 20%. There are estimates out there that it might increase by 100%, 200%, or more. So the energy efficiency progress we might make mitigates some amount of this, but there's also a real possibility that electrification actually has a significantly bigger impact on electricity demand than what we model.
I'm wondering if you can handicap some things for us. The possibility of this high case of electric transmission development, or large increases in demand, great deployment of EVs over time, and renewable energy. It all sounds great, but what are the impediments that we're confronting in each of these areas? Could you maybe discuss that a little bit?
Sure. So we talked about charging infrastructure already, right? So I think this is a very rapidly evolving field. At present, there's a very small percentage of the population buys an electric car, for example, right? We are assuming that as more vehicles are available, as costs come down, that we see a nice S-curve and this flips, right? That is not a given, I think. So for one, on the transportation side, right? So there are, for one, so the charging piece is critical, I think. People need to feel comfortable. So if it turns out that, especially the public and corridor charging is not advancing rapidly, you could see that adoption of the light-duty vehicles sort of gets slowed down quite a bit, I think. So that's on the transportation side for me. That's the one that is most fun to talk about in some sense. Electrifying heating and electrifying industrial processes faces very significant hurdles. And I think much more so than transportation is driven by policy and commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions significantly. It's just that there is not as much technology disruption in the heating space and in industrial space as there is in the transportation sector. Together, industry and buildings represent a comparable share of greenhouse gas emissions. So in a greenhouse gas constraints sort of world, we need to tackle those. I find, so you talked about energy efficiency. I find it very hard to believe that we are going to electrify 100% of our building stock over the next 25 years. That's an extremely tall order because we have to turn over well-established heating systems in hundreds of millions of structures. So there, I think, what will likely happen is some amount of progress on replacing systems, and down the road a lot more emphasis on energy efficiency in the building envelope, for example, which is also hard. But at least there's an established policy and there are established programs to help people retrofit their homes and ultimately build more energy efficient homes. And industry, I think, is there will be instances where this happens by itself, but by and large, without some kind of coordinated greenhouse gas policy that results either in a higher price of the current fuels or some mandates, I think not very much of that is likely going to happen.
I'm going to ask you to come back to transmission development in a minute, but I want to hear from Betsy and Genevieve on impediments to development in those areas.
Well, I think the challenge is, and you've laid them out nicely, on electrified transportation side, it falls into it's technology and markets and policy. In the technology side, we got to keep pushing the costs out. There are vehicles available, again, if we just put it in the passenger side of this, at all price points, but we need all different capabilities. We were talking about people want an SUV, they want an electric pickup truck. We got to have a vehicle in all of those segments, and they have to be price points that people can accept and that they fit their needs, and there has to be infrastructure to serve that. And all that needs to perform in a way that makes people feel comfortable. Though you get in your car, you know what it's going to do, and you want it to do everything you want from it. Like if it has to work in a snowstorm, even if that only happens once every 5 years, and I want it to start and stop every day, and I know how it's going to behave. And so there's a consumer education piece to that too. And then on top of it, there are regulatory structures that can be inhibiting to the speed of uptake. And while I represented trade associations, I like the carrots, not so much the sticks. So the fact is, helping new entrants in the charging space. For instance, there's a lot of utilities trying to get into installing charging infrastructure. Makes sense. They have access to all of the pieces, and they have a lot of patient capital. But there are some regulatory structures that make that difficult at the state level. So helping new entrants invest in charging infrastructure, or helping consumers understand what their options are out there in plug-in cars are all parts of getting to that level.
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on it earlier, but we see transmission as one of the biggest impediments to future wind deployment. Like I said, we have already shown that when you invest in transmission to enable renewables, it pays great dividends, both economically and in other ways like enhanced reliability and increased diversity of resources. But we need to continue to make that investment. We need to continue to build out transmission, not just in the areas that the wind exists, and not just getting those renewables on the grid, but also that larger scale transmission backbone. I think in the long term, we really see, and all the modeling and studies by NREL and others have shown that we need a backbone. We need our national highway system for transmission to be able to balance these different resources across broader footprints, and that we really gain a lot of efficiency, and we can save a lot of money and enable this transformation of the electric sector most efficiently when we have that robust transmission backbone, not just, again, to access lower cost resources, but because of all the flexibility that gives us. And obviously, we didn't really talk about it, but at some point, these electric vehicles may be supplying energy to the grid too. So we need a robust, modern grid that can enable two-way communication and two-way power flows. And so that transmission backbone is absolutely critical to enabling these different technologies. And a couple of the things that are standing in the way of that are certainly on the regulatory side. It is really hard to plan for transmission. It requires, we touched on this earlier, looking out deeply into the future. These are, we say they're 50-year assets, but I think that's conservative. We're using these transmission assets for a lot longer. And it's hard, who knows what the grid's gonna look like, but we know that we can actually make these investments and get much shorter paybacks than that. So we need to not be afraid of the uncertainty in our energy future and know that transmission is kind of a no regrets investment. It delivers a lot of flexibility, whether our resource mix is more wind or more solar. It really can provide a lot of value for consumers. So, improved planning, looking out into the future, planning across broader geographic footprints is absolutely critical. We can't just be planning for our state or our region. We need to be looking more nationally at what consumers need and what the most efficient investments are. And then siting is really becoming more and more challenging for transmission. I think there is just a general growth in NIMBYism in a lot of ways in a lot of parts of the country. And the way that transmission siting works is it's fairly local and state-based. And for infrastructure that's really providing benefits across multiple states and customers across a broad region, RTOs, these regions that work together on transmission, include up to like 14 states. And so when you're looking at the benefits and value of transmission in smaller slices, you're really losing the broader picture. The grid doesn't see state boundaries. Electrons flow as they will. And so I think it's important for citing, we need to be able to get this infrastructure built. And there's a lot of creative folks working on different types of transmission projects and trying to work through some of these things. There's a project that's being developed right now in the Midwest looking to underground high voltage transmission along an existing rail corridor, which is unique and innovative. I don't think that's how all transmission is going to be built, but it's good to see some innovation happening. But we fundamentally need to be able to get these projects built more quickly. More regulatory certainty, better planning can help break a lot of the log jams I think we're seeing today.
Anything you want to add?
I was going to, right, so it also provides an opportunity to respond a little bit to the, the time and space continuum sort of comment that you made. So I do think a challenge, although for all of you in the room, don't think of that as a near-term challenge at all. It will become an interesting challenge way down the road, is the time dimension, where once you have very high shares of renewables, wind, call it wind and solar, various forms of wind and maybe various forms of solar, then managing the entire system across time, and especially across longer time periods, is going to become a challenge. So everything varies. We talked a lot, right? The sun shines during the day, not at night. So you have to, managing the system over a day or a couple of days is pretty easy. It'll become easier and easier and easier with batteries, with more transmission, creating diversity of when the wind blows over here, it doesn't blow over there, and vice versa, so that helps. The electrified uses themselves will help because we can manage charging to some extent. We can create little price incentives that shift the charging over by an hour or two. So those are all flexibility elements in the system that will become more plentiful. But what becomes harder is managing the polar vortex situation when all your heating is electrified. So in other words, when there is sort of a period of 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe this is a year where the solar production is 25% lower than it was in a typical year, or the wind blows 10% or 50% less in a typical year. When we think about it, building an overall system, then those kinds of challenges become much more relevant. However, right, don't think about that now, because we're so far away from that I think actually the other challenge in some sense is scaling. And maybe scaling in connection with some kind of visibility on how the system from a policy perspective evolves over time. So you mentioned offshore wind. New York had established an offshore wind target by 2030 for 2,400 megawatts of capacity. 1 year later, the governor increased it to 9 gigawatts by 2035. The people I talk to in the industry, they go like, oh. So there is currently probably not enough supply chain capacity to actually ramp it up. So if I'm right, or if we're all right, that there's this combination of incremental demand and increasingly a shift to renewables, not just to meet the new demand, but also to meet the existing demand, then we will have to really significantly increase our annual deployment of these renewable resources. You were saying 7 per year. If I sort of go back from what I have to have in 2050, if everything were renewable in 2050, so currently we have 1,000 nuclear plants kind of then, let's just assume we need 2,000 nuclear plants. But of course the capacity factor of wind is less than capacity factor of a nuclear plant. So that's probably more like 4,000 nuclear plants equivalent. And here we are, right? Currently we have like 20 equivalent. So we got to ramp this up pretty substantially. And I think that's really a very significant challenge for the industry overall to get this done in a relatively short period of time.
Great. I'm sure you have questions.
Or not.
Yes.
Talk about how this will impact labor at all in terms of increasing electrification.
Can you
Anything that you've looked at?
repeat?
So the question is how this will impact labor. So I have not looked at that. I have looked at employment impacts of various things, and I think there are two things I would say. One, across the entire electrification process, that's really hard to tell, because So I can look at the electricity industry, and I'm sure there are numbers about clean energy jobs that are significant. My sense is that to the extent that we build our electric infrastructure, that creates jobs. You know, there are not many jobs left in the coal industry and in the fossil industry. So the joke is, used to be like 200 people running a power plant. Now it's one person and a dog, and the dog is there to keep the person from touching the machinery. So it's not a very labor-intensive industry overall. I would think that, and we talked about it before in a little bit, sort of on the transportation side, the implications of the change are significant, potentially very significant, not just electrification, but other changes that take place in transportation, autonomous vehicles, that kind of stuff. Very significant changes that happen. My other point, however, is like, okay, let's just assume that electrified vehicles require fewer workers to put them together, right? Then the question is, so what consequence? What's the policy prescription that comes from that? Since it's quite likely that if the U.S. sort of institutes a policy that says this is going to be bad for workers, we're not going to make any electric cars, somebody else is going to make the electric cars, right? Whether it's the Europeans, maybe. It's the Chinese or the Indians will do them. So it's in some senses, do you want to go from 100 jobs to 60 jobs, or you're going to go from 100 jobs to 0 jobs? And so I had that discussion with some folks in Detroit around the auto industry, and they think about electrification actually in the U.S. and facilitating electrification less than an environmental policy and more like an economic development policy. You know, creating the right environment for this to happen in the United States actually creates a real chance that there will be a transportation industry in the United States, electric car industry, that the current companies or maybe new companies will continue to supply these vehicles in the United States and supply them outside the United States.
I think that's exactly right, and I think it goes to that, just the larger question in auto manufacturing and all manufacturing, technology shifts workforce needs. Department of Energy, the last time it was doing studies in this area a couple years ago, documented 215,000 new jobs just in direct electric vehicle parts manufacturing, so that the new supply chains develop and priorities in those supply chains shift, and I think that's all that's known at this point.
Yeah, I'll briefly add on the wind side, and again, check out our report coming out next week because it'll have the definitive numbers, but I think we're at around 110, 115,000 folks employed in the wind industry in the United States today. And 2 years ago, wind turbine technician was the fastest growing job in the country. I think now it's solar installer and wind turbine tech are the 2 fastest growing jobs in the country. So we're happy to share that with our friends in the solar industry. But jobs in these fields are exploding. And one thing that I'm really proud of the wind industry, it employs veterans at a higher rate than any other sector in the energy field, which kind of makes sense if you think about the types of jobs that are in the industry. They're active, they require teamwork. It's something that's kind of a perfect fit. And I forgot what my other point was. But yeah, I mean, those jobs are growing, and it's something that, the other point was that they're rural jobs, and it's something that I think good paying rural jobs are really hard to come by, and the wind industry is bringing jobs to parts of the country that wind turbine, wind farm jobs are kind of the only new career paths in certain areas, and so it's and they're really good paying jobs too, and they're able to keep people in their local communities working in and around their farms. And so I think that's something that's unique about renewables as well, that, you know, while they are remote, there are parts of the country that really need economic development, and we're able to bring those jobs. So
I think that's actually a really good point. So I'm, as an economist, I do some of these studies, but I'm very skeptical about these sort of, you know, where the primary focus is on jobs. So the unemployment rate is whatever, a 50-year low, and you say, oh my God, it's about jobs. So on average, we don't create a lot of jobs at this point. We're just sort of shifting people around. But exactly to your point, so both onshore wind, which happens in pretty rural places where the resource is fantastic, and offshore wind, which happens on the coasts, where there's really strong economies, but there are fishing industries that basically are dying off. And it's basically a revival opportunity for the marine industry. So in a sort of more targeted sense, the jobs get created in places that need jobs. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I would add to that discussion. A study that was done for wires in 2012, I believe, when we were just beginning this investment cycle. It's a study, it's on our website, on employment and economic development consequences of transmission investment. And what your colleagues estimated is that if we were building the appropriate amount of transmission in anticipation of the kinds of developments we've been talking about, that sector alone would generate 150,000 FTEs, full-time jobs, every year for 20 years. And that was a study that came out at the point in the economic cycle when you remember the government, when it announced its job numbers, were well below 100,000 jobs annually, almost all the time. So that was it was a self-contained economic boom if we had been there. Any other questions for our panel? Sure.
Okay. What do you think about HVDC technology here? Does it have like a key role in this transition or not really?
Could you repeat the HVDC?
HVDC, yeah. What do you think about it? Like, is it going to be important here or not really?
There are two. I guess there are two.
Repeat.
Oh, the question is the role of HVDC, high voltage direct current transmission lines. So my sense is it has more to do with the how to build transmission to connect the renewable resources piece than it has with the electrification piece itself, if you want. But I think there, as was pointed out, so the resources are located all over the place, sometimes really far away from big load zones. So I suspect there are some good arguments for a HVDC to be part of a backbone. It just increases the access from further distances to these resources, and the diversity benefits that we talked about increase.
Yeah, I would just point you to the NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab study that came out last summer, colloquially called the SEAMS study, but they start under the premise of what happens, we've got the eastern and western interconnections which are operating independently, and they have a series of back-to-back DC ties. What would happen if we just expanded the amount of energy that could be traded east to west among those ties? But what they ended up doing was going a little further and saying, well, let's look beyond just expanding the DC ties, because the ties are kind of in the middle of nowhere. There's quite a lot of wind in those areas. It kind of runs through the Dakotas and Colorado, but there's not a lot of load there. So what if we built expanded HVDC capacity from sort of the middle of the eastern interconnect to the middle of the western interconnect? And they found that the value of that investment would be much greater than actually just expanding the DC ties. So I'd certainly recommend taking a look at that study. It showed a lot of value from those types of investments, and it's not dozens and dozens of HVDC backbone transmission lines. It's 6 to 12. It's a handful of them that could really bring a huge amount of value in terms of balancing renewables, increasing connectivity among the regions. But there is still, private interest in developing HVDC in this country. The buried line along the railroad corridor that I mentioned earlier is an HVDC project. It's called the Soo Green Line, SOO. There's a couple of the Clean Line projects are HVDC still being developed. Greenbelt just got approval in Missouri a couple weeks ago. So that project may be moving forward. There's some HVDC projects out west as well, looking to move wind and solar from the southwest and the northwest, California. So I think that those projects I'm not sure it will be the biggest place we see in transmission investment, but I do expect, and it is, I think, a critical piece to the most effective and cost-efficient build-out of that backbone system.
Yeah, and we have a lot of HVDC operating now, and some of it, you know, between Quebec and New England and so forth. We can get that NREL study for you. I'm not sure it's been released, but I have their presentation.
It's on the internet.
Yeah, okay, it's on the internet, yeah. DOE has been sitting on it for a while, but it is a really interesting read. There are 4 basic scenarios, and some of them are all HVDC, some of them depend on a build-out underneath of the AC system too. So it's fascinating stuff, but maybe the augury for the future. Well, hey, thanks a lot for coming. This is terrific. You're welcome to pounce on these folks before they leave the building, but help me thank them for being here.